Have you ever wondered what dark secrets lay hidden beneath the splendor of the Islamic Caliphates? While history often paints a picture of golden palaces, flowing silks, and powerful rulers, another reality lurked in the shadows, one where slaves endured acts of cruelty so shocking they rarely appear in textbooks. Their lives were stripped of choice, their suffering became entertainment, and their humanity was often erased in the name of empire. This isn't the polished story of glory and conquest, it's the raw, untold truth that forces us to question what power truly costs. Before we continue, tell me in the comments what time you're watching this. I love seeing how far and wide our history community reaches. And if you enjoy uncovering the hidden side of history, feel free to subscribe. No pressure, but this is where the past finally speaks. You walk into a bazaar where men, women, and children stand in chains, their bodies inspected like fruit in the market. Buyers tug at arms, peer into mouths, and debate prices as if they're haggling over melons. The smell of spices fills the air, cinnamon, cumin, cardamom, but it does nothing to mask the sour mix of sweat and fear. This is not a hidden corner of the Caliphates. This is center stage. People are the merchandise, and business is booming. As you move between stalls, the sheer variety strikes you. Tall men from Central Asia, dark-skinned captives dragged from African coasts, pale youths taken from Byzantine lands, all displayed side by side. The Caliphate's vast trade routes didn't just move silk and sugar, they moved people. Every conquest, every raid, every pirate attack along the Mediterranean might end with new faces hauled here to be priced like carpets. Isn't it strange how borders that feel distant on a map collapse when you see them embodied in shackled wrists? At one stall, a merchant proudly advertises the skills of a Greek scribe. Buyers nod appreciatively. Owning an educated slave is a mark of refinement. At another, strong young men are praised for their ability to endure heavy work, their backs prodded, as if they were beasts of burden. You notice children clinging to one another, their futures bartered away before they even learn to write their names. How would you react if your son or daughter were reduced to a line item in someone else's ledger? The state took its cut, of course. Slave markets were taxed, regulated, and sometimes even sponsored by local authorities. That means the same governments that boasted of justice and law also filled their treasuries with revenue from human suffering. It's the kind of contradiction you'd expect in a dystopian novel, except this was real life. Think of how governments today regulate cigarettes or casinos, profiting from something destructive while pretending to manage it. The Caliphates treated slavery the same way, not a shameful secret, but a public profitable institution. You catch sight of a nobleman in flowing robes. His servants carry purses of dinars ready to make bulk purchases. For elites, slaves weren't just labor. They were symbols of wealth and prestige. The more exotic, the better. A Turkish bodyguard at your side announced martial strength. A dark-skinned servant from Sudan whispered of distant power. A concubine from Byzantium hinted at luxury and refinement. Like modern billionaires collecting rare cars, these men collected people. Every so often, you hear a voice resist. A captive protest shouting their true name, insisting on freedom. The market swallows their cries. Names don't matter. Here labels do. Buyers don't ask, "Who are you?" They ask, "What can you do?" You're strong, you're pretty, you're educated, you're young. Identity collapses into utility. It's chilling to realize that the very poets who wrote glowing verses about Baghdad's gardens or Cordoba's libraries likely penned them while slaves poured their tea or copied their manuscripts. One merchant assures a buyer that eunuchs will arrive with the next caravan. The tone is casual, businesslike, but the reality is horrific. Boys marched across deserts, subjected to brutal surgeries, all to feed the demand for eunuchs in palaces and harems. You can almost feel the dread in the air, even before that cargo arrives. What kind of world normalizes mutilation as an economic pipeline? The crowd buzzes around you, a mixture of excitement and indifference. Some buyers see opportunity, others see necessity, none see tragedy. And yet beneath the din of bargaining, you can't help noticing the silence of the enslaved. They stand waiting, knowing their lives are about to be rewritten by a stranger's coin purse. For the market, it's just another day. For them, it's the end of one life and the forced beginning of another. This bustling scene isn't an isolated quirk of history. It's the foundation of an empire's wealth. Trade routes that brought exotic goods to palaces also funneled human beings into chains. As you drift past one last stall, the bargaining over bodies still echoing in your ears, you realize that what you've witnessed is only the surface. Behind these displays lies a darker layer of cruelty, an entire economy built not just on labor, but on altering and reshaping bodies to fit the demands of power. You hear whispers in the crowd about a different kind of merchandise, one that costs more than any strong-armed laborer or well-educated scribe. Buyers lean closer when the word eunuch passes between merchants. You follow the murmur and discover a caravan arriving its captives, mostly young boys. Their faces are pale with dread, and their steps falter as they're led not to buyers, but to something far more terrifying: surgeons with knives. This isn't rumor. It's the castration economy, a system that turned mutilation into one of the most profitable industries of the Caliphates. Imagine the logic: palaces and harems demanded guards who could be trusted around women and children, and rulers craved attendants who could never father rival heirs. The solution: eunuch slaves who had been castrated often as boys to serve without threat or family ties. It's jarring to realize how normalized this was. Eunuchs weren't rare oddities. They became an elite class of slaves so sought after that entire trade networks grew around their creation. The process itself was so brutal that many didn't survive it. Contemporary accounts admit that only a fraction of boys lived through the surgery. That meant a single survivor became extraordinarily valuable. In Baghdad or Cairo, eunuchs could fetch prices 10-20 times higher than ordinary slaves. The Caliphates, which prided themselves on scholarship and law, quietly tolerated and taxed this mutilation because the profits were simply too tempting. Doesn't it strike you as bitterly ironic that an empire famous for preserving Aristotle's wisdom also oversaw a marketplace where children's bodies were destroyed for money? You notice how the merchants speak. To them, these boys are investments. They discuss supply and demand with the cool detachment of economists. One caravan from Nubia or the Sahel might yield a handful of eunuchs, another from Central Europe might bring more. Surviving the procedure was seen as proof of quality, as if endurance of agony somehow made a better servant. Imagine today if a luxury brand advertised its products by celebrating how much suffering went into making them. You'd call it barbaric, yet here the pain itself became part of the value. Not all eunuchs ended up in obscurity. Some rose to extraordinary power precisely because they were considered safe. Without families of their own, rulers trusted them to guard harems, control palace access, even manage treasuries. The Byzantine Empire had eunuch generals. The Caliphates followed suit, raising eunuchs to positions where they influenced politics behind the scenes. In some courts, a eunuch might wield more day-to-day power than the ruler himself. Isn't it strange how a system designed to strip boys of agency sometimes catapulted them into authority? Still, for every eunuch who gained influence, countless others lived lives of quiet misery. They were constant reminders of how the market warped human lives. Their voices often described as high-pitched, from the surgeries echoed in palaces as they announced visitors or recited poetry for their masters. Think about that every refined banquet, every elegant poem might have been delivered by someone who had once screamed on an operating table just to exist in that role. You can't help drawing a modern comparison. In a world obsessed with cosmetic surgeries and body modifications, people sometimes pay willingly for procedures to meet society's demands. But in the Caliphates, there was no choice. The bodies of these boys weren't theirs to decide over. They were reshaped by knives because someone else desired a servant who fit a specific mold. When you frame it that way, doesn't it make you wonder how much of our own world still bends human bodies to fit the needs of power? The bazaar you left behind feels almost innocent now compared to this hidden industry. At least their buyers looked you in the eye, even if only to assess your teeth. Here, the commodity is not just the person, but the irreversible act done to them. The value of a eunuch wasn't in who he was, but in what had been taken from him. You realize with a chill that this practice wasn't a dark corner. It was central to how courts functioned. Behind every guarded harem door, behind every throne room curtain, eunuchs stood as silent proof of a system that monetized mutilation. And as the caravan disappears into the city, you sense the pattern. The Caliphates didn't simply conquer land and people, they reshaped them to fit their needs. Slavery here wasn't just ownership. It was transformation, often brutal, always profitable. And if you follow the trail further, you'll find that beyond palaces and harems, whole armies were built on the same principle of human reshaping, grinding slaves into soldiers for wars without end. You hear the clatter of weapons long before you see the soldiers. Metal against metal, shouted commands, the thud of boots slamming against the earth. It's a different kind of marketplace, one where the merchandise has already been purchased, is now being broken in. You stumble into a training ground, wide and dusty, where rows of enslaved boys march in unison under the eyes of officers. They are no longer called by their birth names. They are Mamluks, property of the state molded into soldiers. Unlike the markets where men were bought for kitchens or fields, here the investment was different. These boys were the future backbone of armies. Their value wasn't in menial tasks, but in their ability to fight, bleed, and die. Doesn't it strike you as ironic that the Caliphates, which proclaimed themselves guardians of the faithful, relied so heavily on slave soldiers to defend the faith? The contradiction is almost dizzying. You watch as a drill master barks orders in Arabic. Many of the boys don't even understand the language yet. Some were taken from Christian families in the Caucasus, others from the steppes of Central Asia. They learn quickly, though, because hesitation earns a lash across the back. The sound of the whip slices through the air, crisp and final. A boy stumbles, another helps him up, but the officers scowl. Solidarity is not the lesson here. Obedience is. The training is relentless. From dawn until nightfall, they march, ride, and spar. Wooden swords clatter before they're replaced with real steel. Horses buck beneath inexperienced riders until the boys learn to grip with thighs of iron. Food is meager, sleep scarce, and punishment swift. Slowly, they are transformed into machines of war. You can almost feel the fatigue in your own limbs just watching. And yet for the officers, this is success. A soldier broken of individuality is a soldier ready to serve. Occasionally, a figure stands out taller, sharper, more determined. The officers notice too, and those boys are pushed even harder, groomed for leadership. It's chilling to realize that some of the greatest military leaders of the Islamic world, men who commanded vast territories, began like this, captives molded into weapons. The Mamluks of Egypt would one day overthrow their masters and rule as sultans themselves. Imagine the irony: slaves who became kings, proof that a system meant to dominate sometimes backfired spectacularly. But for most, there is no rise, no glory. The average Mamluk spends his youth drilled into obedience, then his adulthood hurled into battlefields he never chose. The Caliphates used them like renewable resources. When one regiment was shattered in war raids and taxes filled the ranks again. It's not so different from modern corporations that view employees as disposable cogs, except here the stakes were life and death, not quarterly profits. The ground trembles as the soldiers practice a charge. Horses thunder forward, lances gleam, dust rises like a storm cloud. You imagine what it must have been like on the receiving end of such a wall of force. Terrifying. Effective. That's why rulers kept the system alive. Slave soldiers fought with ferocity, not just because they were trained, but because their entire existence depended on it. Lose, and you weren't just defeated, you risked punishment worse than death. You notice how carefully the officers monitor loyalty. Mamluks are isolated from their birth cultures, forbidden from forming families until years of service have passed, and constantly reminded that their survival depends on the state. And yet rebellions did happen. Whole regiments sometimes mutinied, assassinating rulers or installing their own. History records moments when these owned soldiers controlled the fate of empires. Doesn't it make you wonder, how much power can you really hold over someone once you've taught them to fight? The clang of practice swords dies down, and the boys collapse in exhaustion, sweat soaking through their rough tunics. Officers watch with cold eyes, calculating which ones will survive, which ones will fall, and which ones might one day command armies. The marketplace you left behind seems almost merciful compared to this. There a life might be spent serving tea or cleaning courtyards. Here lives are sharpened into blades, guaranteed to spill blood on some battlefield far away. And as you turn from the training ground, the rhythm of marching feet still echoing in your ears, you realize this pattern repeats everywhere. Some slaves polished marble floors, others copied manuscripts, but in the Caliphates, many were destined for this life as soldiers defined by war. Beyond the barracks, though, another fate awaited captives, serving not on dusty battlefields, but inside glittering palaces, where luxury disguised cruelty with silks and gold. You slip past the training grounds, and suddenly the noise changes. No more clashing steel, no barking orders. Instead, the air fills with the scent of rosewater and saffron, the hush of silk brushing marble, and the laughter of courtiers echoing from behind carved wooden screens. Here in the palaces, slaves wear fine fabrics, not shackles, at least not the visible kind. But don't be fooled. Behind every polished tile and golden chandelier lives are still owned, traded, and controlled. Imagine walking through the Caliph's residence in Baghdad. The walls are inlaid with mosaics that shimmer like a kaleidoscope in the lamplight. Fountains bubble with sweet water, and trays of honey cakes glide past on the arms of servants. They smile, bow, and appear effortless, yet every bow is rehearsed, every smile demanded. Some of these attendants were once free children, stolen in raids, now trained to be invisible unless needed. Doesn't it unsettle you that the beauty of a palace often rests on unseen pain? In the heart of these palaces were the harem's private worlds, hidden from the public eye. To outsiders, they were symbols of exotic luxury rooms, filled with women, music, and perfumed air. But for the concubines inside, many of whom were slaves, it was a gilded cage. They had no choice about where they lived, whom they served, or whom they pleased. A single misstep could mean punishment or replacement. Can you picture the weight of living under constant scrutiny, where even your beauty becomes a trap? One striking example is Shagab, the mother of Caliph al-Muqtadir in the 10th century. She had once been a slave concubine, yet she rose to wield immense influence in the court, effectively governing. From behind the curtains, her story shows how the system could elevate some, but only by first trapping them inside it. For every Shagab who navigated the labyrinth of palace politics, countless others vanished into anonymity, their names lost, even as their labor and presence shaped empires. Concubines weren't the only ones caught in this net. Male servants too lived in a strange tension. Eunuchs patrolled the harem doors, acting as guardians of secrets they never chose to hold. Kitchen slaves spent hours preparing banquets they were forbidden to taste. Musicians entertained nobles with songs that reminded them of homes they'd never see again. To the guests, it was all seamless hospitality. To the enslaved, it was endless performance. Doesn't it sound uncomfortably like those modern luxury hotels, where staff smile on command? Except here, the job was for life and escape impossible. The irony deepens when you realize how many celebrated scholars and poets of the Caliphates depended on these palaces, intellectual salons, where philosophy and science flourished, were staffed by slaves who brewed the tea, lit the lamps, and sometimes even transcribed the texts. Civilization's golden moments were scaffolded by invisible labor. Think about that the next time you read a poem from Andalusia, or admire the architecture of Cairo somewhere in the background. A slave's hands were sweeping, serving, or suffering. Even the architecture itself reflected this imbalance. Wide courtyards and endless corridors weren't just for grandeur. They allowed slaves to remain in constant motion, always available, always close, yet never truly seen. It's like the way modern skyscrapers hide janitors and service elevators, necessary, invisible, and designed to vanish behind the facade of luxury. History has always had a knack for disguising its labor. In these palaces, fear was subtle but sharp. A concubine might be replaced without warning, a servant dismissed, or worse, if they displeased a master. Rumors tell of poisoning, silent punishments, and bodies disappearing into gardens at night. Nothing leaves a palace faster than gossip, yet nothing is harder to confirm. You're left with the eerie sense that the glitter hides as much cruelty as the battlefields. At least soldiers knew they might die. Here the punishment was living without freedom, day after day in endless performance. And when the last lamp was extinguished and the marble corridors fell quiet, the truth remained: the palaces dazzled, but their brilliance was fed by invisible chains. Beyond those walls, far from the scent of saffron and the glow of mosaic lamps, the empire demanded something harsher. Still captives, driven into the vast emptiness of the desert, their survival gambled against the sun itself. The sun is merciless, the sand stretching into horizons that shimmer with false promises of water. And there, trudging across the burning expanse, you see the next stage of bondage caravans of slaves forced into desert marches. No silk curtains, no fountains, no music. Just blistered feet, cracked lips, and the weight of chains dragging in rhythm with weary steps. The caravans weren't small. Some stretched for miles with hundreds of captives roped together, guarded by mounted men whose eyes were fixed on the dunes rather than the suffering at their side. The goal was clear: move human cargo from one edge of the empire to the other, across deserts that swallowed the weak whole. Doesn't it make you shiver to imagine a journey where a single misstep or fainting spell could mean being abandoned to the sand? The Sahara became both highway and graveyard. Captives were marched from sub-Saharan Africa northward, often for weeks, even months. The desert didn't care about profit margins. It claimed the old, the sick, the too young. Traders knew this, yet they still crammed their caravans, gambling that enough would survive to make the trip profitable. To them, every body lost was an unfortunate statistic, nothing more. Imagine boarding a plane today with 200 passengers, knowing half would never land, and calling that business as usual. Survivors described the agony of thirst mouths too dry to speak, eyes burning in the glare, and skin cracking under sun that showed no mercy. The march had its own soundtrack: the groan of camels, the creak of leather harnesses, the occasional thud when someone collapsed. Guards rarely stopped to help. Water was rationed cruelly, always measured against profit. If a captive stumbled too often, the desert claimed them. Isn't it strange how human life shrinks to a calculation when money takes the lead? Occasionally you notice how geography shaped cruelty. Wells dotted across the Sahara became checkpoints of survival. Entire towns sprang up to serve this traffic, their prosperity built on the desperation of those passing through. Oases weren't havens. They were toll booths. The price of reaching one alive was measured in lashes endured and tears shed on the sand. And yet, paradoxically, these death marches also built connections. The cities of North Africa swelled with new populations because of them. Cairo, Tunis, and Fez pulsed with the presence of men and women who had survived the desert gauntlet only to find themselves sold again in coastal markets. Their forced footsteps stitched together continents linking sub-Saharan Africa with the Mediterranean world in a chain of suffering. Think about how global trade today links continents with container ships. Back then, the containers walked shackled and sunburnt across deserts instead of oceans. You catch sight of one young girl stumbling, her body too small for the journey. She is pulled forward by the rope, connecting her to the line. The guard looks away, muttering about losses. And just like that, she becomes one more body left for the vultures, one more ghost swallowed by sand. How many nameless graves lie hidden under those dunes, marked only by bones that tell no stories? The sheer inhumanity makes you wonder why the system persisted. The answer is simple: profit outweighed compassion. The value of slaves at the destination justified the risk. For the traders, the desert was a brutal filter. Those who survived fetched high prices in Mediterranean ports or Middle Eastern cities. Survival itself became part of their market value proof of strength, endurance, and utility. As the caravan drags on, dust rising with each step, you notice something else: silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy quiet of people, too exhausted to speak, too broken to cry. The desert is indifferent. It doesn't hear prayers or curses, only the crunch of sand under endless feet. And that silence follows the captives into the cities, into the markets, into the very fabric of empire. When the last figure disappears over the dune, you can almost still hear the rattle of chains fading into the heat. The palace glitter feels far away now. What remains is the memory of suffering, measured not in hours, but in miles, walked beneath a killing sun. And yet, for all the cruelty of desert marches, the empire's appetite didn't stop there. Beyond the dunes, another kind of transaction waited, one that reduced children themselves to coins in the hands of buyers. You don't need to walk far into the markets to see who the next victims are. Children, small bodies, wide eyes, trembling hands stand at the center of attention as buyers argue over them with the same tone they'd use when haggling for rugs. The cruelty of it hits harder than the desert sun. Here in the heart of the Caliphates, children were not just victims of raids and marches, they were commodities in their own right. The demand was endless. Boys could be molded into servants, scribes, or soldiers. Girls could be trained as concubines, entertainers, or domestic workers. The logic was simple and brutal. The younger, the captive, the more years of service ahead. Doesn't it make you shudder to realize that a child's very youth, what should be their protection, was the reason their value soared? You notice buyers probing with questions. Can the boy read? Has the girl been trained to sing? One merchant assures a customer that the boy is bright and will learn quickly. Another boasts that the girl is healthy and obedient. Their identities vanish into checklist futures erased in the clang of coins. It's not hard to imagine modern parallels. Think of how internships or apprenticeships promise bright futures. Except here, the career path is chosen by force and ends in chains. One of the most infamous systems that targeted children was the Dev Shirmi, later used by the Ottomans. Christian families in the Balkans were forced to surrender their sons, who were then converted, trained, and folded into the empire's ranks as janissaries. To the Caliphates, it wasn't just about manpower. It was about reshaping communities, severing children from their roots, and bending them to serve. Imagine the terror of a parent watching soldiers march into their village, knowing their child might never return. And the cruelty didn't always wait until adulthood to show its teeth. Child slaves were often subjected to brutal labor from the start. Kitchens, fields, stables all demanded bodies, and children filled the gaps because they were easier to control. Traders treated them as flexible investments. A boy might start sweeping floors, then be trained for the military. A girl might serve in the laundry before being sold again to a wealthier master. How do you measure a life when it's bartered in stages like livestock at auction? Every now and then, stories emerge of individuals who broke through the chains. Some child slaves rose to prominence, the talents too great to ignore. Poets, scholars, even rulers, in rare cases, had childhoods rooted in captivity. But these are exceptions, not rules. For most, the chains were lifelong. The empire's grandeur depended on making sure those exceptions were rare enough to prove the system worked. Think of it in modern terms. We prize children's education, seeing it as investment in their future. The Caliphates also saw children as investments, but the returns were measured in loyalty, obedience, and profit for someone else. It flips the very idea of childhood upside down. No play, no choice, no dreaming, just training for service. Doesn't that contrast make you uneasy about how fragile the line is between nurturing and exploiting? You pause as a boy, no older than 8, clings to his mother's hand. The merchant tears him away, and she screams, but her cries are drowned out by the market's noise. The boy is passed to a buyer who inspects him like cargo. The image lingers, a bond broken in seconds, replaced by a contract that sees only utility. How many times did this happen across centuries? Too many for history to record, though each one left scars on both the taken and those left behind. The markets buzz on unbothered. To the traders, children are simply smaller bodies with longer shelf lives. To the empire, they are the clay from which servant soldiers and concubines can be molded. And as the noise of bargaining fades in your ears, the image of those young captives refuses to leave. Because beyond the city walls, another nightmare awaited the mines and pits, where even adults struggled to survive, and where children sent, there rarely lasted long. You descend into the earth, and the light vanishes almost instantly. The air thickens with dust, salt stings your throat, and the sound of dripping water echoes in the darkness. Here in the mines of the Caliphates, slaves were not sold for their beauty or trained for palaces. They were consumed body and soul by the earth itself. If the bazaars felt cruel, the mines feel merciless. You can sense immediately that this is not a place for life. It is a place for bones. The salt mines in particular were notorious. Salt was as precious as gold in its own way, needed for food preservation trade and daily life. But harvesting it meant long hours underground, where air barely moved, and the walls themselves seemed to claw at lungs. Slaves were sent down with crude tools, hacking at rock that never gave back easily. You can almost hear the scrape of iron against stone, the wheeze of chests pulling in toxic air, the groans of bodies collapsing before their shift was done. Unlike soldiers or palace servants, miners had no chance at rising in rank or influence. They were not investments meant to last. They were disposable. Traders and owners knew the mines devoured people quickly, so they sent captives here like fuel tossed into a fire. Isn't it chilling to think of a system that factored in death as part of its business plan? Historical accounts describe skeletons littering tunnels, bodies left where they fell, because dragging them out cost too much effort. Salt preserved flesh, so corpses sometimes lingered intact, grim reminders for the living of what awaited them. Imagine swinging your pickaxe next to a body that never made it out the empty sockets, staring as if to say, "This will be you soon." How much would that weigh on your spirit with every strike? The mines weren't limited to salt. There were also quarries for stone pits, for metals, and labor camps, where slaves hauled material for the empire's construction projects. The great mosques, fortresses, and palaces that awe travelers even today were built with stone carved by hands that often never saw daylight again. Next time you admire the domes of Cairo or the walls of Baghdad, consider the unseen lives ground away to lift them skyward. Occasionally, whispers slip through the dust about uprisings. Desperate slaves tried to break free from these pits, driven not by hope of freedom, but by raw instinct to escape death underground. Most rebellions were crushed swiftly, but the very fact they happened shows the resilience of human spirit. Even in a place designed to kill the will to resist, flickered. Doesn't it remind you of miners in more recent centuries, striking for safety, for pay, for dignity, facing batons and bullets? Different time, same struggle for humanity against profit. Yet the Caliphates had no unions, no negotiations. A slave's collapse was simply a gap to be filled by the next captive dragged into the tunnel. Guards didn't fear revolt because the mines themselves broke bodies faster than rebellion could spread, and those who tried to flee had little chance escape meant running across barren landscapes with no supplies, only to be hunted down or swallowed by the desert. What lingers most is the silence. Unlike the bustling markets or echoing palaces, the mines muffled everything. No bargaining voices, no laughter of nobles. Just the steady, hopeless rhythm of pickaxes in the dark. It's the kind of silence that presses into your ears and makes you realize how quickly life can vanish when treated as expendable. Climb back toward the surface, the sunlight stabbing your eyes after so long in gloom. And as you breathe fresh air again, you can't shake the thought of those left behind, condemned to vanish in tunnels where salt clings to skin and bones alike. The empire's monuments glitter above ground, but deep beneath entire generations of slaves dissolved into dust. The silence of the mines lingers in your ears, but now it's broken by something far louder. Chance shouts, the clash of weapons, and the roar of fire. You've stumbled into the memory of one of the most explosive uprisings the Caliphates ever faced, the Zanj Revolt. For years, enslaved laborers in the salt marshes of southern Iraq had endured backbreaking work, cutting reeds and digging ditches in heat that wilted even the strongest bodies. They were Africans, mostly from East Africa, and they had been treated as the lowest of the low. But in the 9th century, they rose up, and for a moment, the empire trembled. Picture it, thousands of slaves, once bent double in fields, now marching with weapons fashioned from farming tools. Their leader, Ali ibn Muhammad, promised not only freedom, but vengeance, and the ranks swelled as anger spread. Camps turned into fortresses, chants turned into battle cries, and the caliphate found itself facing an army of those it had thought voiceless. Isn't it strange how often history underestimates the people it tries hardest to silence? At first, the rebels had startling success. They raided towns, captured supplies, and even defeated professional soldiers sent against them. For nearly 15 years, the Zanj controlled swaths of territory, building a state within a state. The very people once dismissed as disposable had turned into a political and military force. It must have been surreal for the elites of Baghdad to realize that their wealth rooted in the toil of these slaves was now funding their rebellion. But rebellion invited brutal response. The caliphate could not tolerate such defiance, and resources were poured into crushing the uprising. General after general marched armies south, burning villages suspected of harboring rebels, slaughtering captives, and salting the earth where resistance lingered. Slowly, the tide turned. By the end, tens of thousands were dead, both rebels and innocents caught in the storm. The rebellion was drowned in blood and fire, leaving scars that echoed for generations. Still, the very existence of the Zanj Revolt left a mark. It proved that slaves were not passive, not resigned to their fate. They resisted, and they did so with enough force to shake one of the world's greatest empires. Doesn't that make you question how much of history's order was really held together by fear, and how much by sheer luck that rebellions failed? And the Zanj weren't alone. Other revolts flared across the caliphates, smaller, shorter, but carrying the same message: people will endure only so much before they push back. Slave soldiers mutinied concubines. Conspired miners tried to flee. Each uprising was met with harsh reprisals, yet each whispered the same truth: even chains can't completely silence a human spirit. You can almost hear the debates that followed in the palaces of Baghdad. Advisors warning the caliphs that reliance on slaves was risky, generals insisting that stronger control was the only answer, poets hinting in cautious verses at the cost of cruelty. And yet nothing changed. The system was too profitable, too woven into the fabric of empire. A few cracks could be patched with brutality as long as the wealth kept flowing. It's hard not to think of modern parallels. Whenever oppressed groups rise up, whether workers striking in factories colonize people demanding independence, or citizens pushing against dictators, the pattern repeats. First, they're underestimated, then they're feared, and finally they're punished. The cycle is as old as empire itself. The Zanj revolt is just one dramatic reminder that history's peace often rests on silence enforced at sword point. When the fires of rebellion finally died down, the salt marshes returned to their eerie rhythm of labor. But the memory of the revolt lingered, an unspoken ghost haunting both masters and slaves. To the Caliphate, it was a lesson in control. To the enslaved, it was proof that even the weakest link in the chain could rattle the whole. The smoke of rebellion fades, and in its place, you find yourself wandering through libraries, lecture halls, and gardens where scholars recite verses under the shade of orange trees. The Caliphates prided themselves on their learning, Baghdad's house of wisdom, Cordoba's dazzling libraries, Cairo's scholars debating astronomy and medicine. To a visitor, it all seems like a golden age, a beacon of knowledge in a world still stumbling in darkness. But if you pause, listen closely, and look behind the walls, you notice something unsettling. All this brilliance rests squarely on the backs of the enslaved. Books don't copy themselves. Behind every elegant manuscript, slaves labored as scribes hunched over parchment for hours, ink staining their fingers. Behind every astronomical instrument polished to perfection, slaves worked metal and wood, turning raw materials into the tools of discovery. Even the very stones of the madrasas and libraries were quarried, hauled, and stacked by slaves who would never be allowed to read the works they helped preserve. Isn't it a contradiction worth dwelling on that knowledge meant to illuminate humanity was built on the suffering of those denied the right to learn? Imagine strolling through Cordoba at its height. The city gleams with paved roads, fountains, and hundreds of mosques. Scholars from across Europe and Africa come to study there, dazzled by the libraries, said to hold hundreds of thousands of volumes. Yet somewhere nearby, slaves sweep the streets, clean the scholars' chambers, prepare the meals, and maintain the water channels. The glittering jewel of Al-Andalus shone because invisible hands kept polishing it. Some of those enslaved were not just laborers, they were intellectuals forced into service. Greek and Persian captives with knowledge of philosophy, medicine, or mathematics were compelled to translate their genius, repackaged as the empire's glory. In later generations, it looked like the Caliphates generously preserved classical wisdom. In reality, many of those voices were preserved because they were never allowed to stop working. How often do we celebrate ideas without acknowledging the conditions that extracted them? You overhear a scholar praising the refinement of court life music, poetry, calligraphy. He recites verses about beauty, but you can see slaves in the background holding lamps so the recital can stretch into the night. The irony is sharp. Even leisure required someone else's exhaustion. It's a reminder of how civilizations often balance on a hidden tier of suffering. Think of modern universities with manicured campuses and gleaming labs. How many rely on underpaid janitors cafeteria workers, or migrant labor to function. History rarely changes the script, it just swaps the costumes. Occasionally, a name emerges from the shadows. Al-Mamun's library flourished, thanks in part to enslaved scribes. The grandeur of Cordoba's water system owed much to captives from Christian lands. But for every name that survives, thousands are forgotten. They left no treatises, no poems, no monuments, only the faint fingerprints of their labor on someone else's achievements. Doesn't it make you wonder how many silent contributors have been erased from every golden age you've ever read about? Even religion itself wasn't free of this contradiction. Mosques rose with majesty, their domes glimmering in sunlight, their call to prayer echoing over cities. But the marble slabs, the carved wood, the polished lamps, all were touched by slave hands. To the faithful, these structures inspired awe. To the workers who hauled stones under whips, they may have felt more like tombs for their stolen time. The line between devotion and exploitation blurred under the weight of empire. The contradiction is sharpest when you recall the scholars themselves, many of whom wrote eloquently about justice, virtue, and the moral duties of rulers. They debated the soul's freedom while their lamps were trimmed by men and women who had none. They praised God's mercy while benefiting from human cruelty. Perhaps they saw the irony and stayed silent. Perhaps silence was the price of survival. Either way, the legacy of their brilliance is entangled with the shadows that sustained it. You walk away from the libraries and markets, and the weight of it all begins to press on you. The palaces built on invisible hands, the armies trained from stolen boys, the deserts littered with nameless graves. The Caliphates dazzled the world with wealth, learning, and faith, yet beneath the glitter chains rattled in every corner. And here's the hook that jolts you awake. Centuries later, the shadows of those chains still linger in culture memory, and even in the quiet ways societies justify power today. Think about it. Stories of eunuchs guarding harems, soldiers born in bondage, rising to topple dynasties, rebellions, shaking empires, but buried in silence, all of it lives on, sometimes as legend, sometimes as shame. The legacy isn't just in dusty chronicles. It's in how people still wrestle with inequality, with labor invisible, yet essential, with systems that reward the few while exhausting the many. Doesn't it unsettle you to realize how much of that script is still being replayed in new costumes? You imagine standing in modern Baghdad or Cairo, cities that pulse with life today, but still carry echoes of their past. Streets built over old markets, mosques, rising on foundations laid by hands that never chose the work families, whose histories trace back to both masters and slaves. Memory is never clean. It clings like dust on stone. Every time someone praises a golden age, you can't help but wonder, golden for whom? The irony deepens when you think of how history is taught. Children learn of caliphs, scholars, and victories, but the voices of the enslaved rarely appear in textbooks. Their lives were deemed expendable in their own time, and their stories remain expendable in ours. What's preserved are the palaces and poems. What's lost are the cries in the desert and the songs unsung in the mines. Isn't it haunting how silence itself becomes a kind of inheritance, and yet you sense resilience in those forgotten lives? For every system designed to crush people found ways to endure, to resist, to leave small marks on the world around them. Rebellions like the Zanj didn't survive, but they proved that defiance was possible. Eunuchs wielded influence where they weren't meant to. Concubines like Shagab bent politics to their will. Even in the darkest pits, humanity refused to vanish entirely. That flicker of resistance becomes its own legacy, carried forward in whispers, stories, and memory. You pause and look back across the sweep of history. From bustling bazaars to glittering palaces, from scorching deserts to suffocating mines. You've walked through a world where human lives were reshaped, consumed, and forgotten. But the long shadow of slavery isn't just a relic of the Caliphates. It's a reminder that no empire, no golden age, stands free of its hidden costs. Behind every shining monument lies a ledger of suffering. And if we don't remember it, we risk repeating it. So you let the silence settle, now heavier than the mines, broader than the desert. The story of the Caliphate's slaves is not just their story, it's part of humanity's. And maybe the final question isn't about them at all, but about us. When future generations look back at our world, will they see freedom honestly lived? Or will they find another golden facade hiding chains in the shadows? The echoes of chains, deserts, and palaces still linger, yet history never pauses at a single cruelty. What you've seen in the markets, mines, and marches was only one side of empire's shadow. But beyond the slave blocks, another story unfolded, one cloaked in silk, whispered in hidden chambers, and written in the lives of men forced into roles few dared to name. Male concubines, paraded as symbols of luxury and control, endured a theater of power that was every bit as brutal as the battlefield or the mine. Their stories were hushed, their fates twisted by the whims of rulers who saw them as both ornaments and threats. And if the market shocked you, what came next was darker still. Imagine standing in the middle of a bustling marketplace, not as a shopper, but as the item for sale. The smell of spices, the cries of merchants, the clinking of coins, it should all feel ordinary. Yet today, every sound rings like a drum, announcing that your childhood has ended. You are one of the boys, recruited for service in the palaces of the Islamic Caliphates. And although they promise silk garments and honeyed dates, what really awaits you is a life wrapped in control and silence. The moment you cross the palace gates, the world changes shape. Behind you, freedom shrinks into memory. Ahead, the marble courtyards dazzle your eyes, filled with attendants moving like shadows. Soldiers stand rigid, eunuchs watch carefully. Scribes keep records of names that might never be spoken aloud again. For your family, this was an honor to serve so close to power. But inside, you feel the gnawing unease that every bargain comes with hidden chains. You're lined up with other boys, some still sniffling as though they've only just been weaned, others stiffening their chins in a desperate imitation of bravery. Officials pace back and forth, evaluating you the way horse traders check teeth or posture. They measure limbs, scrutinize skin, note every feature. It is humiliating, and yet there's an unsettling pride you've been chosen. Isn't being chosen supposed to mean something better? The irony hangs in the air like incense smoke. At first glance, the palace overwhelms with splendor. The chandeliers blaze with oil lamps, and the scent of roasted lamb mixed with saffron drifts through silk curtains. Servants carry trays of honey-soaked pastries, so sweet they make your jaw ache. You might almost believe you've stepped into paradise, except every luxury doubles as a leash. The lesson is clear. The more you accept, the more bound you become. Have you ever been offered something that looked like a dream, only to realize later it came with invisible strings? That's the trap here, velvet disguising shackles. Not all boys arrive through persuasion. Many come as spoils of conquest, Imagine being taken from a Byzantine village or a mountain settlement in the Caucasus your parents left behind and suddenly being polished into a servant for a ruler who sees your existence as proof of his power. History shows the diversity of these recruits. Greeks, Slavs, Armenians, even Turks, before their rise to dominance. Identity is wiped away like chalk on a slate. Here you are no longer Georgian or Circassian, you are palace property. For the caliphs, recruitment isn't just about service, it is a safeguard. Trusting noble families is risky. Loyalty can splinter with politics. But a boy with no ties beyond the palace depends entirely on the caliph. That dependence becomes control. Chroniclers like al-Tabari noted how carefully these recruits were watched, cut off from their roots. Imagine, in today's world, if someone deleted your entire phone, your social media, every contact, you'd be left standing with no history. That's what these boys experienced centuries earlier. Sometimes a boy resists. He might cry too loudly, refuse to learn the new language, or drag his feet during training. But rebellion is short-lived. The palace has little patience, and replacements are plentiful. You learn quickly that survival demands performance. Smile when asked. Walk gracefully. Remember every step of court etiquette. Doesn't it sound eerily like workplaces today, where employees paste on smiles to keep jobs, even when they long to shout? Even in these early stages, hierarchies emerge. The most striking boys are singled out for special grooming, instructed to carry themselves with elegance. Others are marked for roles as attendants, guards, or scribes. The palace functions like a machine with many gears, and you are slotted into your part whether you understand it or not. Institutions still work this way. You think you're free, but often your future is decided before you even learn the rules. Psychological conditioning begins early. You're told the palace is now your only family, the caliph your guardian, your god, your axis of existence. Disobedience isn't just insubordination, it is betrayal of divine order. That manipulation is both clever and cruel. Imagine being 14, still confused about your voice changing, and suddenly responsible for serving a man whose word can shape empires. Most bend under the weight of that intimidation. And yet, in the quiet corners, small rebellions flicker. Some boys whisper their mother tongue at night, careful not to be overheard. Others scratch names into bedposts, tiny graffiti of identity soon scrubbed away, but meaningful for a moment. Picture one boy tracing the letters of his birth name into wood, knowing it will vanish by dawn, yet refusing to let himself be erased completely. So, recruitment is not a simple beginning. It is already a transformation. You entered as a boy, promised silk, but what you inherit is obedience rehearsed like a script. The gate has shut, the curtain has lifted, and the play begins with you, cast as an unwilling actor. You wake to the sound of sandals scraping against marble, the shuffle of attendants carrying trays, and the faint ring of a brass bell calling boys like you into order. If the recruitment was the grand doorway into this world, then grooming is the reshaping of everything that made you who you were. They don't just want your service. They want your identity stripped down and rebuilt into something pliable. Behind the ornate walls, this training is disguised as refinement. But you soon realize refinement is simply a polite word for control. Every day unfolds in routines designed to erase the old you. Language lessons begin at dawn, tutors drilling Arabic or Persian into your tongue, until your village dialect sounds strange in your own ears. You stumble through verses and phrases, punished not with whips, but with public correction, that burns your pride like a lash. It is clever, no bruises left to show, but the sting of humiliation ensures you learn quickly. Have you ever noticed how people remember embarrassment longer than pain? That was their strategy centuries before psychology had a name for it. Next comes the art of posture. You are taught how to walk without making a sound, how to bow at the precise angle that shows submission, without appearing clumsy, how to sit cross-legged with poise during long ceremonies. You might laugh at the detail, but the palace takes posture seriously. To slouch is to dishonor, and dishonor is a dangerous label in a court where suspicion can be fatal. Imagine a modern job interview where crossing your arms might cost you a chance here. Such a slip could cost you much more than a career. Your grooming extends beyond body and voice. Clothes are issued, and suddenly the rough wool of your village tunic is replaced with silks dyed in colors you never knew existed. Yet the beauty of the fabric only deepens your sense of distance from your old life. It is like being costumed for a role you didn't audition for. You touch the sleeves, marvel at the shimmer, but inside, you know these garments are uniforms, not gifts. Some caliphs demanded that concubines also learn poetry and music, turning them into performers for intimate gatherings. The stories of Abbasid courts tell of nights filled with song verses recited under the glow of lamps, the caliph lounging as concubines entertained. For a boy, once chasing goats in a mountain pasture, memorizing lines of classical Arabic poetry feels absurd. But the palace doesn't ask what feels natural. It molds you until absurdity becomes routine. And then there is grooming of the mind. Officials feed you carefully measured stories. The caliph is God's shadow on earth. The palace is your heaven. Loyalty is your salvation. They repeat it until you begin to question your own memories. Did your family truly love you, or were they right to send you here? Were you lucky, perhaps, to be chosen? This is how manipulation works. It doesn't strike like a hammer. It seeps like water into cracks, eroding certainty bit by bit. Of course, competition is also woven into grooming. You notice how tutors praise one boy more than the rest, subtly planting rivalry. A compliment about his recitation becomes a thorn in your side, pushing you to try harder to outshine. The palace thrives on this divided boys never unite. Isn't it interesting how workplaces even today pit employees against each other for performance bonuses, knowing unity is the real threat? The caliphs already understood that centuries ago. Historical accounts mention how some concubines rose to surprising influence, especially those who mastered court etiquette flawlessly. A boy who pleased the caliph could be showered with privileges, even wealth, though such gifts were as fragile as glass. You might recall names like Badr al-Jamali or other figures who started in servitude and climbed into positions of power, proof that the palace ladder existed, but with rungs greased by danger. For every success story, countless others vanished nameless. And what about daily discipline? You eat what they give you when they give it. Meals are smaller than the feasts you first glimpsed, carefully rationed to keep you lean, nimble, and obedient. Overindulgence is frowned upon. The lesson is sharp pleasure belongs to the rulers, restraint to the servants. Even your body is trained into limitation. It's like the way athletes today live under strict diets and schedules, except here you are not training for medals, but for survival in a gilded cage. By the time weeks turn into months, you catch yourself forgetting your old laughter, your old accent, even the names of your childhood friends. The grooming has worked, When you look into a polished copper mirror, you see the silks, the poise, the rehearsed obedience. But where is the boy who arrived through those palace gates? He's still there somewhere under the costumes and etiquette drills, but buried so deeply that some nights you wonder if he will ever resurface. The moment arrives with no warning. You think you are being led to another lesson, another endless drill in posture or verse, but instead the corridor narrows, the air thickens, and the whispers around you fall silent. Today is the day you are reshaped, not just in manners, but in flesh. If grooming was meant to train your identity, this ordeal of castration is designed to make it irreversible. You step into the chamber heart thudding, already sensing that what happens here will carve away not just your body, but your future. In Caliphates, eunuchs formed an entire class indispensable in palaces precisely because they could be trusted, or at least rulers believed so. Without families, without heirs, without the distracting ties of ordinary men, eunuchs were thought to serve with singular loyalty. At least that was the theory. For boys like you, the cost of creating such loyalty was staggering. Historical records note how thousands of boys were subjected to this process, many not surviving the operation. Those who did survive were forever marked both physically and socially. The chamber itself is simple, almost insultingly so. No gold, no silks, no poetry, only stone walls and attendants with expressions emptied of pity. Some sources describe how such procedures were often carried out by specialists captured from conquered regions, men who became infamous for their skills. It is chilling to imagine that an empire powerful enough to stretch from Spain to Persia still relied on individuals whose task was the brutal alteration of boys. Doesn't it remind you of how modern systems outsource their most unpleasant jobs, keeping their hands clean, while the dirty work is done elsewhere? Pain fills the air, though no one speaks of it. You are told to be strong, that this is the price of serving the caliph. The attendants work quickly with blades and cloths, and there is no choice but to submit. Some boys survive only because of luck, their wounds healing without infection. Others disappear from the dormitories, names never mentioned again. Survival itself becomes a strange kind of privilege, a twisted badge of belonging. The aftermath is no less cruel. You are bandaged, confined to a bed, left to recover with only thin gruel for sustenance. The silence of those nights is heavy, broken only by the groans of others who underwent the same fate. Have you ever lain awake after a painful experience, unable to find comfort in any position? Multiply that by the knowledge that this suffering was forced, not chosen. That is the weight pressing down on your chest. Yet the palace frames this ordeal as elevation. The eunuch is praised as pure, safe, worthy of trust near the caliph's wives and daughters. The irony is bitter. What was taken from you becomes the very reason you are declared honorable. It's like breaking someone's legs and then applauding them for being less likely to run away. History is full of such twisted rationalizations. Some eunuchs rose to remarkable power, managing treasuries, commanding armies, even influencing succession disputes. Figures like Nasr al-Hajib in Al-Andalus or Kafur in Egypt prove that the empire could elevate eunuchs to near-regal authority. But for every celebrated figure, there were countless unnamed concubines whose suffering paved the way. You can almost hear them asking from the silence, why must our pain become the foundation of someone else's glory? Even after recovery, reminders of the ordeal never fade. Your voice may change higher, and smoother than before, forever marking you as different. Your body may carry scars hidden under silk, but in the mirror of others' gazes, they are always visible. In the palace hierarchy, this difference defines you. You are no longer just a servant. You are a eunuch, a concubine, a figure both trusted and ridiculed, admired and pitied. That duality follows you like a shadow in every chamber you enter. Modern readers might wonder, why didn't boys resist? The answer is simple and heartbreaking. Resistance meant death, and death was swift. Choosing survival, even with suffering, became the only path. It is a pattern that repeats across history. People endure unspeakable transformations, not because they accept them, but because the alternative leaves no room to breathe. So the ordeal of castration is not merely a physical act. It is a ritual of control, a message carved into the bodies of boys that the palace owns them entirely. You entered the palace as a boy promised silks and sweets. You emerged from the chamber, reshaped, scarred, and forever tethered to a role you never asked to play. What happens when boys, stripped of their pasts, are forced to live side by side, each trained, reshaped, and scarred, yet all desperate for the same sliver of favor? The answer is simple. Rivalry becomes oxygen. From the moment you limp out of the chamber of pain, you realize that survival now depends not just on obedience, but on outshining the others. In the Caliphates' palaces, concubines were not united brothers in suffering. They were competitors, pawns forced to claw against each other in contests as bitter as any battlefield. At breakfast, you see it play out in subtle ways. One boy straightens his spine a little taller, hoping the supervisor notices. Another recites a verse louder than required, angling for praise. You do the same without even meaning to. Rivalry creeps in quietly like ivy, curling around stone, and before long, it is everywhere. Have you ever been in a classroom or office where people compete not for excellence, but for the teacher's or boss's fleeting nod? That is the daily air you breathe now, but with consequences that weigh heavier than any lost grade or missed promotion. The caliphs and their officials designed it that way. Divide and rule. When concubines squabbled, they wasted energy that might otherwise have fueled rebellion. A boy who watched his rival carefully had no time to whisper about escape. Historical chronicles speak of jealousies that turned violent concubines sabotaging each other, with rumors accusing one another of disloyalty, or even fighting in hidden corners. The palace became a theater where intrigue was constant, and you could never be sure whether a smile was genuine or a trap. Sometimes the contests were deliberate. Supervisors might instruct you to compose a poem, then pit you against another boy in a recitation before an audience. The one who faltered was mocked, the one who triumphed given extra privileges. It sounds almost like a talent show, but the stakes were survival. A caliph's disfavor could mean exile, punishment, or disappearance. Imagine standing on stage, knowing that a single forgotten word might erase you from memory forever. The rivalry extended into daily chores. If you dressed too slowly, another boy might report your laziness. If you lingered too long, polishing a lamp, someone else would accuse you of daydreaming. Trust became dangerous. Even friendships were weaponized as rivals learned to smile while collecting secrets to twist later. The palace rewarded suspicion, and soon suspicion was all you knew. There are stories of concubines whose rivalries turned into infamous feuds. In some courts, boys competed for the caliph's attention with such intensity that alliances formed like miniature factions. One favored attendant might gather a circle of supporters, while another built his own. It mirrored politics at the highest levels, where viziers and generals schemed for power, except here the stakes were personal survival. Do you see the irony? Boys torn from their families became mirror images of the very politics that had uprooted them. Even physical beauty became a weapon. Those with striking looks learned to wield charm like a blade, knowing that favor often hinged on appearance. Others envied, resented, sometimes plotted to bring them down. Compliments were rarely free of poison. Have you ever noticed how in modern life praise in competitive environments often hides rivalry beneath the same pattern played out here centuries earlier, only sharpened by the palace's brutal context? But rivalry was not always cruel in appearance. Sometimes it wore the mask of entertainment. The caliph might summon concubines to perform dances or recite lines in playful contests, laughing as he judged winners and losers. To him, it was leisure. To you, it was a test wrapped in gold. If you failed, laughter could turn into condemnation. And once condemned, a concubine's fall was swift. For all its toxicity, rivalry also carved cunning into you. You learned to read faces like texts, to sense when a compliment carried a hidden barb, to predict when a rival might strike with rumor or betrayal. These skills born of survival sharpened you in ways no tutor could. History often notes how palace concubines became masters of intrigue, and it is easy to see why, in a world where trust meant vulnerability, suspicion became your shield. And so, jealousy became the pulse of your daily life. You woke each morning, not only fearing the caliph's judgment, but also bracing against rivals, watching your every move. You went to sleep, knowing whispers might follow you into dreams. Rivalry wasn't an occasional test. It was the air you breathed, the ground. You walked the constant reminder that in the palace, companionship was a luxury you could never afford. In a palace where rivalry gnawed at you from every corner, power was never a steady possession. It was a lure, dangled like a candle flame that burned anyone who reached too close. The caliph himself, seated on cushions embroidered with gold thread, understood that intimacy was more than pleasure. It was leverage. Every glance, every beckoning finger, every whispered summons was part of a larger game, loyalty bent, twisted, and reshaped through fear and favor. Imagine being summoned unexpectedly. One moment you are polishing brass trays, the next, a eunuch announces your presence is required in the inner chambers. Your stomach lurches. This could mean privilege, fine food, new silks, perhaps a chance at influence. Or it could mean exposure, a single misstep under the caliph's eye that costs you everything. Power here is not earned, but bestowed, as fickle as the direction of smoke. Have you ever known a boss who used unpredictability to keep people off balance? Multiply that tenfold, and you have the caliph's method of control. The intimacy expected of concubines blurred lines. You are trained to flatter with words, to anticipate moods, to offer comfort when asked. These acts are not merely personal, they are political. A caliph who trusts you with his leisure is also testing your silence. He wants proof that what happens behind curtains stays there. If you speak too freely, rivals can twist your words. If you stay silent, you might be rewarded. Either way, intimacy is less about affection and more about the leash of secrecy. Consider how officials feared the wrong whispers. Concubines, after all, often overheard political conversations in private moments. That made them both valuable and dangerous. Some were commanded to report what they heard, others punished for knowing too much. The irony is sharp. You are trained to be invisible, yet sometimes Your very presence makes you threatening. In that paradox, the caliph tightens his grip, reminding you that your worth depends entirely on his favor. History offers striking examples. Kafur, once a slave eunuch in Egypt, rose to such influence that he effectively ruled the state after his master's death. His power came not from armies alone, but from the intimacy of trust he had cultivated. Yet his story is the exception, not the rule. For most concubines, intimacy never translated to security. It remained a performance staged for the caliph's amusement and political advantage, with no guarantee of lasting reward. The palace also wielded fear as a teaching tool. You might hear of another concubine who stumbled a poorly chosen phrase, a misplaced glance, and was suddenly dismissed, demoted, or worse. The story circulates like a warning bell. Favor is a blade with two edges. If you lean too close, you can be cut. You sleep lighter afterward, rehearsing every word in your mind before it leaves your lips. Doesn't it echo how even today people rehearse emails or conversations with superiors, afraid one slip might end their chances? Your rivals, of course, watch closely. They know that a single rumor about your behavior can tilt the caliph's perception. Suddenly, you are balancing on a tightrope where intimacy is demanded, but vulnerability punished. You learn to cultivate a smile that reveals nothing, a tone that flatters without seeming too eager. The skills of survival here resemble those of an actor, always aware of your audience, always careful not to break character. At times, the caliph tests loyalty by offering gifts, rings, coins, rare garments. To refuse is unthinkable. To accept too eagerly marks you as greedy. Either choice can be used against you. The gifts are less about generosity than about weaving invisible debts. You owe him, and he never lets you forget it. In that way, intimacy transforms into chains of gratitude forged so delicately that outsiders might call them favors. Even laughter is political. If the caliph laughs at a jest, you laugh too, though sometimes you do not understand the joke. If he falls silent, your smile vanishes at once. Your own emotions are no longer yours. They are mirrors reflecting the moods of power. Slowly, you begin to wonder if you remember how to feel authentically at all. So intimacy in the palace is never about closeness in the way ordinary people know it. It is about leverage, about bending loyalty with silks and fear. You become fluent in gestures, practiced in masks, skilled at hiding thoughts. And in that performance, you realize the truth. Here, intimacy is not a bridge between hearts, but a leash held tightly in the caliph's hand. Night falls in the palace, and with it comes the strange paradox of silence. By day, you are pulled between lessons, rivalries, and sudden summons. But when the lamps are dimmed and the corridors echo only with distant footsteps, you discover that solitude here is not peace, it is surveillance. The walls of the caliph's residence are thick, but the eyes behind them are sharper than glass. Isolation becomes another form of punishment, and desire, which might have been natural in any other life, is turned into a crime that stalks you even in your sleep. Your chamber is small, its ceiling low, its windows barred with lattices that let in light but conceal you from the outside. You might think of it as a cell disguised with cushions. At first, the solitude feels almost welcome after endless drills and watchful tutors. But soon, the quiet becomes suffocating. You know that attendants patrol outside, listening for any sound. Whisper too much stir too often, and a report will find its way up the chain of command. It is a peculiar kind of loneliness being utterly alone, and yet never unwatched. Desire is where this surveillance bites deepest. You are young, your body restless, your emotions unpredictable. In any village outside the walls, a boy your age might stumble clumsily toward affection, toward laughter shared under trees, or stolen moments in a marketplace. Here those instincts are marked as danger. Any hint of intimacy outside the caliph's sanction is treated as betrayal. You are told your body belongs not to you, but to the palace, and therefore every impulse must be guarded. It's almost comic, isn't it, how something so universal becomes dangerous when filtered through power. The punishments are whispered about more than they are seen. A boy caught lingering too close to another might suddenly vanish from the dormitories. Others report him gone to the kitchens or to distant postings, but the silence tells a different story. Fear is more effective than spectacle. Uncertainty keeps everyone cautious. Have you ever noticed how rumors can control people even more effectively than rules? The same was true here. Boys policed themselves because they could never quite be sure where the line lay. Even dreams betray you. You wake in the night with your heart racing, unsure whether someone heard your restless shifting. The body has its own language, and here that language feels incriminating. The isolation chambers are not designed for rest, they are designed for control. Sleep becomes shallow, never fully safe, as though you are always rehearsing discipline, even in slumber. Historical accounts describe eunuchs assigned specifically to monitor concubines, reporting not only their conduct during the day, but their demeanor at night. A sigh, a word, a gesture could be interpreted as defiance. It is astonishing how much energy was invested in policing the private lives of boys, whose only crime was existing too close to power. Imagine if every private thought of yours at home or work were audited by unseen supervisors. That is the weight pressing on your chest. And yet even under such surveillance, the human spirit searches for cracks. Some concubines carve faint symbols into wooden beams, private codes of resilience. Others hum tunes under their breath, fragments of melodies from their childhood villages. These tiny acts may seem trivial, but in a world where desire is punishable, even a half-forgotten song becomes rebellion. It reminds you that though the palace can isolate, it cannot completely extinguish the ember of self. Sometimes you catch the eyes of another boy across the courtyard, and for the briefest moment, you recognize the same loneliness mirrored back. No words pass between you, because words are dangerous, but the glance itself is a reminder that you are not alone in your isolation. That glance is gone in an instant, swallowed by the weight of watchfulness, yet it lingers in your memory like contraband. Isn't it remarkable how even the smallest connection becomes precious when scarcity is enforced? So the nights stretch on long corridors of silence where you learn to police even your own heartbeat. The chambers are not cages of iron, but of air constructed with vigilance, sustained by fear, filled with a loneliness so thick it seeps into your bones. In a palace of music, poetry, and light, you discover that the darkest prison is the one no one else can see. Picture it the same halls where caliphs stroll in jeweled robes, where lamps glitter against marble, suddenly transform into stages of shame. If the isolation chambers suffocate you in silence, then public humiliation exposes you in ways even more brutal. This is the hook of cruelty, when a concubine slips, when loyalty falters, when suspicion whispers too loudly, punishment becomes performance. The court thrives on spectacle, and your humiliation is entertainment wrapped in authority. It begins with the summons. A eunuch approaches, voice flat announcing, "Your presence is required in the audience hall." You already know this isn't the kind of summons that offers rewards or gifts. The walk feels longer than usual, your sandals echoing too loudly against the stone. By the time you arrive, your body trembles even before the accusations begin. Sometimes you don't even know what you're accused of neglecting a duty, speaking too freely, maybe a rumor planted by a rival. But the details hardly matter. What matters is that the Caliph wishes to make an example of you. The punishments vary, but the goal is always the same: to strip dignity. You might be ordered to kneel in front of courtiers, head bowed, while attendants laugh at your mistakes. In some courts, concubines were paraded through corridors in mock displays, adorned not with silk, but with rags, a warning to others. Doesn't it sound eerily familiar? To how, even in modern workplaces or schools, people are sometimes singled out and humiliated in front of peers, not because the failure is great, but because it serves as a reminder of authority. Multiply that by 10, and you feel the weight of the palace's gaze. Chronicles from the Abbasid era mention moments where disgraced attendants were demoted to menial tasks, forced to clean stables or kitchens after once wearing finery. The contrast is deliberate. Yesterday, you were draped in silk. Today, you scrub floors with rags. The swing itself is the punishment. You can endure hunger. You can endure pain. But being made ridiculous in front of rivals cuts deepest. You learn that here, the weapon sharper than any blade is laughter at your expense. There are whispers of harsher shaming, too. Some concubines were beaten in courtyards where others could watch. The lash wasn't just about pain. It was a theater of obedience. To see another boy punished ensured you never forgot the palace's grip. Fear spread like wildfire after such displays, and silence returned quickly because no one wanted to be next. It is chilling to imagine a system so polished that even cruelty became choreography. Yet humiliation wasn't always physical. Sometimes it was psychological, a cutting remark from the caliph in front of his guests, branding you foolish or unworthy. A single insult from the throne could destroy your standing invite rivals to pile on and leave you scrambling to recover. The words linger longer than bruises. Have you ever replayed an insult in your head for days, unable to shake it off? Now imagine that insult echoed through a palace where every nod and whisper determines your future. Historical figures confirm this culture of spectacle. The Fatimid court, for instance, recorded how attendants who lost favor were deliberately degraded in view of others. It was not enough to remove them. They had to be displayed as cautionary tales. And once the humiliation was staged, the victim rarely returned to influence. The fall was permanent, etched into memory. Even those who escaped harsh punishment still carried the fear of it. You find yourself overcorrecting, rehearsing every movement, terrified that some trivial mistake might spark ridicule. Your laughter grows cautious, your speech measured. Slowly, humiliation becomes preventative. You humiliate yourself in small ways, just to avoid the larger spectacle. You bow lower, apologize faster, erase yourself before others can erase you. And still, the palace thrives on these displays. For the caliph and courtiers, they reinforce hierarchy. For rivals, they provide sport. For you, they become scars on memory, reminders that survival here is not only about obedience, but about never giving anyone an excuse to turn you into theater. So public shaming becomes the shadow lurking behind every task. You polish the lamp. You recite the verse. You carry the tray, not only because it is duty, but because failure means becoming the evening's entertainment. And in a palace filled with music and laughter, you learn that sometimes the loudest sound is the echo of your own humiliation. By now, you understand the pattern. In the palace, favor is fleeting rivalry, constant, and humiliation always waiting. But the cruelest truth reveals itself later, when the curtain falls and your usefulness fades. Once you were trained, polished, reshaped into a servant of the Caliph. Once you were draped in silks, summoned to chambers envied by rivals. And then almost overnight, you are no longer wanted. Exile or disposal, that is the final act waiting for most concubines. It rarely comes with explanation. One morning, the eunuch arrives, not with orders for grooming or summons, but with instructions to pack what little you own. Sometimes you are told you will be sent to another palace, perhaps in a distant province. Other times, you are simply removed, no destination named. The palace does not waste words on those it discards. In the echoing corridors, you realize how easily memory erases those who no longer please. Exile can take many forms. Some are reassigned to menial tasks in distant estates, stripped of silks and forced into obscurity. Others are married off to low-ranking officials, a gesture framed as kindness, but really a disposal method ensuring you vanish quietly into someone else's household. In harsher cases, concubines disappear altogether, their absence explained away by vague phrases, sent away fallen ill no longer needed. Have you noticed how even today's bureaucracies, phrases like downsizing or realignment soften what is really dismissal? The same linguistic veil covered these boys' fates centuries ago. The cruelty lies not just in being cast out, but in the contrast. You once walked halls where poets recited verses, where jewels glittered under chandeliers, where your smallest gesture was scrutinized because it mattered. Suddenly, you find yourself in obscurity, forgotten, as though you never existed. The silence of exile is sometimes heavier than the noise of humiliation. Imagine going from the center of spectacle to the margins of nothingness. It leaves you questioning whether the years in between were real. History offers examples. Records from Abbasid and Fatimid courts describe attendants once cherished, later sent away without ceremony. Chroniclers sometimes note them in passing, as though their removal mattered only because it hinted at shifting power in the palace. The individuals themselves remain faceless, absorbed into the void of history. You can almost hear the fading voices asking, did we live, or were we merely shadows in someone else's play? Some concubines tried to cling to memory. They carried with them fragments of poetry, learned in the palace, small tokens, given as gifts, habits of etiquette drilled into their bones. But outside the palace, these skills were often useless. Who cares if you can walk silently on marble when you're sweeping dust from a courtyard? The mismatch adds insult to injury. The very training that once defined you becomes baggage in the outside world. And yet, disposal wasn't always gentle. Rivalries didn't vanish just because you were exiled. Sometimes rivals orchestrated your fall, spreading rumors, until removal was the only outcome. Other times, suspicion alone sealed your fate. A glance misinterpreted, a word misplaced, and suddenly you are gone. The fragility of survival in the palace becomes stark in those final moments. It reminds you of how even in modern careers, people can rise quickly, but fall faster, not from incompetence, but from politics, whispered in rooms they never enter. The cruelest part is the erasure. Inside the palace, your presence once mattered. Outside, no one remembers your name. Chroniclers record the caliphs, the viziers, the poets, sometimes even the cooks who created delicacies. But concubines, once central to the rhythm of court life, dissolve into anonymity the moment they are discarded. You are both essential and invisible, indispensable and disposable. It is a contradiction too sharp to ignore. So exile or disposal is not simply the end of service, it is the proof that in the machinery of empire, you were never more than a part to be replaced. One day polished, the next discarded, you realize that your life was measured not in years, but in usefulness. And when that usefulness ended, so did your place in the story. In the emptiness left after exile and disposal, something curious stirs whispers. They creep through corridors, float across courtyards, slip between locked chambers. Whispers of concubines who refused to vanish quietly, who dared to resist even if resistance was as fragile as a half-spoken rumor. The palace, for all its power, could never completely silence the human urge to rebel. Some of these whispers speak of escapes. A boy who slipped away during a procession, blending into the crowd, never seen again. Another who bribed a guard with jewels given by the caliph, trading silk for freedom. Were these stories true? No one ever knows for certain. That uncertainty is part of their power. You hear them in hushed tones at night, and though you pretend not to believe, your heart races with the thought, what if escape is possible? Haven't you too? Once heard stories of someone who walked away from an impossible situation and found a new life and wondered if you could do the same. Other whispers are of defiance within the palace walls. Boys carving secret symbols into beams, smuggling notes written in hidden languages, or refusing to bow quite as deeply as expected. Small acts easily overlooked by the caliph, but magnified in the eyes of fellow concubines who saw courage where obedience had smothered it. History rarely records these rebellions, but you know they must have existed. After all, what empire has ever truly crushed every spark of dissent? Some resistance came from those who rose high enough to wield real influence. Eunuchs who gained authority sometimes used their positions to shield younger concubines, protecting them from harsher punishments. Chroniclers note how powerful eunuchs could sway politics, even choose successors. Their power was unusual, but their quiet acts of rebellion, favoring one boy smuggling mercy into a merciless system, were even more remarkable. They remind you that rebellion isn't always loud. Sometimes it is the decision to ease another's suffering, even when the system demands cruelty. And then there are the darker whispers, the ones officials pretend not to hear. Stories of poison slipped into cups of attendants who vanished mysteriously after pushing too far. Rumors that some concubines driven to despair chose to end their lives rather than remain pawns. These tales are spoken only in shadows, but their existence proves a simple truth: no prison, no matter how gilded, is free of cracks. What makes these whispers powerful is not whether they are true, but what they inspire. To a boy, lying in his isolation chamber, the idea that someone escaped becomes a thread of hope. To another, humiliated in front of courtiers, hearing that someone once defied the caliph's commands becomes a spark of dignity. Even if the stories are exaggerated, they live because they are needed. Haven't you noticed how communities under pressure always invent legends of resistance, heroes who break chains, rebels who outwit tyrants? The palace concubines were no different. Occasionally, these whispers even reach the ears of historians. Accounts of concubines plotting escape of eunuchs, wielding power to protect their own, appear in fragments scattered through chronicles. They are brief, almost reluctant, as though the writers feared acknowledging them. Yet their presence on parchment proves that rebellion left marks too deep to erase. What's striking is how these acts of defiance echo across centuries. They remind us that even in systems built to crush individuality, people carve out moments of autonomy. A boy scribbling his birth name, another humming his village's melody, another daring to look the caliph in the eye for half a second longer than permitted. All these are rebellions, small but real. And so, the palace, for all its walls, never quite achieves total control. The whispers survive. They grow with each retelling, stretching truth into legend, but always carrying the same message: obedience was demanded, but resistance existed. For concubines reduced to silence, those rumors were lifelines, proof that they were not entirely broken. Imagine history's grand stage after the curtains fall. The lights dim, the poets leave, the caliphs are buried in marble tombs, and still the echoes remain. This is the final hook, not the jewels, not the feasts, not even the battles recorded in gilded manuscripts, but the scars of those who served unseen. Male concubines, reshaped by force, humiliated in public, discarded in silence, left behind legacies, not of names, but of wounds. And wounds, though invisible to most, ripple forward in time like cracks in old stone. The scars live first in memory. Chroniclers, cautious though they were, sometimes hint at the toll. They mention the eunuchs who rose high, yes, but behind everyone was a multitude erased. The silence of missing names tells its own story. You can almost picture the countless faces, never written down boys, who carried their pain to forgotten graves. Isn't it strange how history glorifies rulers, yet leaves invisible the suffering that made their glory possible? Those scars also shaped how the world viewed loyalty. Eunuchs became symbols of obedience, but their existence whispered a darker truth, that loyalty could be manufactured through mutilation, through fear. The lesson filtered outward across courts, across empires, that power could bend humans like metal if the forge was hot enough. Later dynasties in Ottoman Turkey and even in Ming China echoed the same system, proof that cruelty travels easily when it appears effective. For the concubines themselves, the legacy was personal. The scars carried into exile marked them for life, distinguishing them in ways no silks could hide. A voice too high, a body too altered, a manner too polished. These became identifiers long after the palace doors closed. Some may have found quiet lives in distant towns, others positions in lesser courts, but the past never released them. They were always different shadows of an empire that refused to vanish. You see it too in the way their stories survive. Legends of escape, whispers of rebellion, tales of concubines who defied caliphs, they persist not because they are neatly written in chronicles, but because memory itself demands them. Communities retell these stories to remind themselves that even in oppression, defiance flickers. It's the same reason modern societies remember tales of whistleblowers, exiles, or rebels who stood against impossible odds. The human spirit clings to these sparks as proof that dignity cannot be crushed completely. Some historians argue that the scars of concubines influenced palace culture itself. A court built on fear breeds paranoia, and paranoia breeds instability. Caliphs who relied too heavily on eunuchs and concubines often found themselves entangled in plots their own tools control, turning unpredictable. The legacy of scars, then, was not only personal, but political. It weakened the very institutions that created them. Isn't it ironic, in trying to perfect loyalty, the Caliphates may have sown seeds of distrust that hastened their own decline? But beyond politics, the scars shape how we remember. When we study the Abbasid or Fatimid courts, we marvel at poetry, architecture, science. Yet woven invisibly through those achievements is the suffering of concubines, whose lives made such splendor possible. Their absence from the official record is itself a reminder history is written not just by victors, but also by those who decide which voices to silence. As you drift through these stories, you cannot help but wonder whose names are we erasing today, even as we celebrate modern empires of business, politics, or culture. And so, the legacy of scars is twofold. For the boys themselves, it was a personal prison they never fully escaped. For history, it is a shadow cast over golden palaces, a whisper beneath triumphant verses. The scars say, "Remember us even if our names are gone." Remember that empires are not only measured in mosaics and manuscripts, but in the cost of those who had no choice. You close your eyes and hear again the faint murmurs of concubines scratching cymbals into beams, humming songs under their breath, glancing at one another across courtyards. Those moments were their resistance, their dignity, their way of refusing total erasure. Centuries later, the scars they carried become lessons for us, that cruelty disguised as refinement is still cruelty, that silence often hides deeper stories, and that the most horrifying acts are not always the most visible, but the ones hidden behind curtains of gold. And now, as the last lamps of the palace flicker out in your imagination, let the story rest quietly. You have walked through gates of marble, heard whispers in corridors, felt the weight of rivalry, humiliation, exile, and the scars that history left behind. The tale of the male concubines is not just one of cruelty, but of resilience, of small rebellions hidden in silence. Empires rose and fell, yet their suffering lingers like echoes in stone, reminding us that even splendor is built on shadows. As you breathe slowly, let those echoes soften, fading into the calm of night. The struggles of the past remain in history's care,